Hey everyone, so today we are going to look at sketching nature again, but today we're going to use ink. So I'm just going through my old nib box. I've had this since I was about 15, 16, so it's a bit tired, but I finally found one that I thought would work. It gets so far, but you want some nibs if you've got them, or some paintbrushes. We're going to be using both. I've just got a little selection and some different inks. So this is an acrylic ink, which is nice and thick and it's got a really dark coverage. There's a Winsor & Newton black. This is a permanent ink. It's probably my favourite. I've been using it for years. And I also used a little bit of this Indian ink. So this is non-waterproof, which means that you can re-wet it again with a paintbrush if you want to. So that can be really useful sometimes for doing illustrations. You can get inks in a lot of different colours, so that's my sort of set that I use occasionally. They're good fun. These are just a couple of pages of my sketchbook, so quite often I love just having a mess around with ink. It really frees up the hand and you can do lots of different things with it. So the first thing I do is get my nib holder and my nib, so I choose my nib and pop it in there. You don't have to be very rough with these, you can just sort of slide them into the holders. Holders are normally just a couple of pounds if you don't have one, and then we dip that straight into our ink bottle and get sketching. So my first suggestion to you is just have a play and have an experiment. Try drawing lines, see how the nib works, how the nib responds. When you apply pressure it will do different things. You can do some lovely cross hatching. If you look at old Victorian illustrations, like Arthur Rackham is a great one to look at for inspiration when it comes to line work. Another great illustrator is Aubrey Beardsley, who's quite good to look at. Both use sort of line weight and very traditional, well, they're both Victorian traditional line weights, so it kind of steps away from that digital media that we can quite often sort of be engulfed in these days. So I do quite like a good old-fashioned pen nib. I think there's something about using these traditional materials, you'll naturally get a sort of more traditional feel to it, especially when we get into illustrating some natural objects later. You'll get that very almost Victorian notebook style feeling. So my top tip with pens and inks is just play and experiment. So maybe do some circles, do some lines, let part of it dry, go over the top with some more lines, just see what you can make it do. Try not to break your nib, it can happen. And if you want to change inks, I suggest rinsing off your nib, but always when you rinse it off, dry it, because otherwise it can go rusty. And that's why mine have gone rusty, so don't do my mistakes. Learn from my mistakes and always dry your nibs off. You can use some kitchen roll, or I prefer this old rag. I use it for all sorts, so that works really well for me. I'm actually going to change nibs as well because I feel that the flow of ink isn't working quite right off this one. It's something that you'll start to feel and notice as you work more with inks and pens. You'll start to know when you want to change to a different nib. Okay, so this time I'm using the Winsor & Newton black. This is the permanent black. It's the one with the little spider and the top hat on the bottle. You'll know if you know. So this is a really nice thick ink. It is permanent, which means you can go over the top with watercolours or watercolour pencils and it's not going to run anywhere. I recommend a fairly thick paper when working with ink, just so that it can take it and it doesn't start ripping or anything with your nib as well. Again, I recommend just having a play and seeing what you can make it do, what can you make the pen do, how can you make the ink flow. Just get used to the material before you start to try and apply it to anything. show you how I use paintbrushes with ink. I tend to wet them first just so they've got a nice point and take most of that moisture off. I quite often just use my fingertips. I really like using rigger brushes because they're really fine pointed on the end, but you can use them on the side as well, and you get a really almost Eastern kind of feel to the painting and to the lines. So that can be really interesting to experiment with how much water to ink to put in. So if you dip it in water first, the water is going to be at the top of the brush so that when you ink up, the ink sits lower. So if you go to the side, as you'll see, you get different textures as you paint. You get almost like a gradient of water to ink. It's something really great to experiment with. If you're interested in this water to ink sort of methodology, I recommend reading up about sumi, which is Japanese ink painting. Their use of ink and water is really interesting, and you can learn a lot when reading up about it. They also have some very interesting takes on what it means to paint and where paint and art comes from, and sort of the cathartic energy that works within that. It's really, something I've really enjoyed researching. So here I'm just making a mess, basically seeing how much is the ink that's dried. It was the Indian ink, how much is that going to reactivate when I start playing around. I've also got my big brush, which I've just loaded up with ink to make some more marks and just have a play, using it on the side, on the tip, just generally having an experimental play and seeing what happens. Mine has just turned black, and this is a massive jar, so it does mean that you can keep going for a little bit longer without having to change the water. Onto the sketching, and I'm using my favourite bit of lavender that sits on my desk. So we're going in with our fine nib and simply sketching like you would with a pencil. The only thing you might want to take note of is the direction in which your hand moves. You don't want to push the pen away from your body, you kind of want to work towards you or side to side, otherwise the nib will stick into the paper. So I'm just grabbing a little shell that I picked up on the beach the other day. It's a little bit worn and holy, which I quite like, these odd sort of broken things. And I'm giving this a little quick sketch before I move on to another technique. Just remember, things don't have to look perfect. Like, it's only a sketchbook, it's just a sketch, it's for you, it's not for anyone else, unless it turns out amazing and then you can go, hey, look what I did. So don't worry, what happens in your sketchbook kind of stays in your sketchbook, unless you're like me and you're recording it. So just be free. Okay, so moving on to using brushes. So think about the techniques that I showed you earlier, how you can use the tip and then you can also use the side. So again, it's a very sort of Sumi-esque, Japanese-esque way of painting, but it works really well. And I'm using the tip to create that delicate stem and then pushing down ever so slightly to create each individual petal, each individual sort of little lavender bud. You can always go back in and add little details. So I sort of the main shape in one go, and then I added little tiny touches afterwards with my paintbrush. Stem's created by a thin line created by the very tip, but then pushing down where I see those little growths where the other flowers used to be. So I'm actually using the pressure I put on the paintbrush to make the marks to show the object. Don't forget, while the ink's still wet, you can always go back in with a paintbrush and some water to wet it and create different tones and gradients. My top tips are do lots of sketching, keep sketching, have lots of fun and really experiment, and be creating lots of wonderful sketches in no time.